All right, welcome to another reading of How to Lose a Planet, the Afrofuture Epic. Still in Chapter 2. By another measure, the prison's design was political. People felt safer knowing their prisons were guarded by flesh and blood instead of machines that could be hacked. But people failed to appreciate how a guard's soul could be hacked as readily as a machine's programming. He considered his chances of having actually been swallowed by some monster made of concrete and iron while tossing out mindless responses like a hand shooing a housefly. Inmates knew when to be boring the way chameleons knew when to change colors, and monotony had been one of his most trusted defenses during his incarceration, his aim to be too bland for an inmate to try hurting or to try loving. His most recent failure at monotony was why the inkheads were angry with him instead of merely offended by his existence. For months, while alone in a segregated cell, he pondered the rare lack of discipline which had sent him to segregation. He worried that he was becoming too weak to survive prison. The challenge of monotony was that sometimes closing himself off had him thinking that he had died, and that his parched existence was his afterlife, had him thinking that he was killed while in the army, or maybe even before he joined. But if he was alive, as he believed, this journalist, Lacey Simmons, threatened his limp existence, and in front of one of the guards, who often enough were friendly with the prison's gangers. Just by being black and unaffiliated with anyone, he would be done in if the guard only mentioned this interview to the inkheads. Then he would have guests in his cell later that night carrying shivs and socks full of padlocks, also known as slocks. He sat up straight. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that last question? I zoned out for a second." "Not a problem," she said. "I asked if it's true that you're from here, from Quest City." "Yeah, I'm a city kid. Got my equivalence degree at 16, joined the army as soon as I could, and ended up here." He suspected that he also feared her because she was a free woman, freer than the inmates, the prison staff, and even the visitors who were all feeding the concrete and iron monster that she'd entered willingly and would leave unscathed, as if she were just a breath. And what concerned him was what messages this breath might carry out for others to hear. Months from now, this moment would be reduced to a payment noted on her tax forms, while he would still be worrying about whether he'd misspoken to an outsider. Still, he'd wanted to talk, to feel like a human being despite inhumane conditions. She was the first face-to-face contact he'd had in some time, and though he clamped his mouth shut after naming himself a city kid, with his feet hiding under his chair and his knees bouncing up and down, he had wanted to say more. He wanted to talk about how he never knew he was a city kid until he experienced the loneliness of a backwoods army post. The night skies had been almost clear enough to throw a reflection, like an oil spill splashed with chunky sea salt, but there was hardly anybody around to share the experience with, to gaze at 3 or 4 moons with and wonder what people were doing on them. He wanted to tell her what his life was like before someone slapped a pair of handcuffs on him. Because despite still understanding what good manners looked like, being polite was a struggle, a performance he hadn't practiced in a while. She wore a charcoal pantsuit with shoes designed for comfort over style, but he was fresh out of months of solitary confinement, wearing the handcuffs, leg irons, and one-piece orange suit of a maximum security inmates. His imagination had Lacey sitting up straight as if she were interviewing a celebrity crush instead of a convict, and spreading her legs apart just a little farther. But maybe more conversation would have civilized him. She scribbled notes with her head lowered, blonde strands hiding her face. He knew only to sit silently and wait. He wanted her to feel comfortable. Her feeling comfortable would help him feel normal, a condition prison life had taught him to long for, though he never believed he understood what normalcy was, only that normalcy was absent. Her pen jabbed at the page, and he wondered if the interview was finished. The cuffs gnawed at his wrist, and there was a pink fly circling the ceiling's light. The floor wax smelled of flowers, and a spot of rust on one of the window's bars reminded him of a birthmark on his mother's forearm. His mind trailed back to her last question. "What about you?" he said. "You city? Your family from here?" She looked at him with tightened lips and her eyebrows squeezed close together. The gaze wasn't rude, at least not by prison standards, but he suspected he had broken a rule and wondered if she would now leave. She grinned, as if aware of the awkwardness. Her eyebrows were still tensed. "No," she said. "I grew up in a small town on the 6th moon." He nodded.